So I'm back with the new developments in batch release testing presentations, with the final chapter being bacterial endotoxin testing. So I'm going to follow a similar format to what I did with the mycoplasma presentation, and I'll look at what you need to know about endotoxins, the traditional GMP endotoxin test. I'm going to look a bit about horseshoe crabs, and I'll come to that in a minute, new developments in endotoxin testing, and also 2 testing kits that are available. So bacterial toxins can be classified as either exotoxins or endotoxins, and I've got a diagram over here that summarizes that for you, but exotoxins are secreted by bacteria and released outside of the cell, whereas endotoxins are actually part of the membrane of gram-negative bacteria. Endotoxins are also known as lipopolysaccharides, or LPS, and they're made of 3 parts: the antigen, the polysaccharide core, and the lipid A portion. If we just look closer at the membrane of the gram-negative bacteria, here you can see how this is formed. Now, endotoxins are also called a pyrogen because they can cause a fever, and in serious cases they can cause endotoxic shock in a patient and even death. Endotoxins, although not the only pyrogen, are the most significant pyrogen in our industry. And why is that? Well, the next most significant pyrogen, it's a peptidoglycan from gram-positive bacteria, is 50,000 times less pyrogenic. Also, an endotoxin is a very, very stable molecule. To remove endotoxin, the temperature has to be at least 250 degrees C for more than 30 minutes, which not many products can stand. Endotoxin tests, though, I have to say, are not sterility tests. LPS can be present even if the sample is sterile. Like I said, they can withstand extremely high temperatures, and they can also resist almost all other sterilization methods, including radiation and filtering. Any product, really, that comes into contact with the circulatory system, the lymphatic system, or spinal fluid could result in a serious endotoxin reaction in a patient. So you will find the traditional GMP endotoxin test detailed in the European Pharmacopoeia in 2.6.14 and in the US Pharmacopoeia in Chapter 85. The traditional endotoxin test is also often referred to as the bacterial endotoxin test, so you will often see it referred to as the BET assay, and it's one of the most sensitive tests in the world, and that's because it uses something called LAL. This reagent is limulus amoebocyte lysate, and it coagulates or can be adapted to change color upon contact with endotoxin. And there are 3 main ways you can use LAL to detect endotoxins. Firstly is the gel clot technique. It was the first technique that was developed, and it's qualitative rather than quantitative. The sample and LAL are mixed 1:1 and incubated for 60 minutes. Then, if you have a look at the diagram on the top left here, you'll see that if the clot forms, then it's a positive result, whereas if the clot breaks, then it's a negative result. The gel clot technique is the cheapest, but it has limited sensitivity, and qualification is a separate assay. There also may be analyst error. For example, if you turn the tube too vigorously, the clot could break when it's actually a positive result. The second method is the turbidimetric test. And in this test, again, the sample and LAL are mixed at a ratio of 1:1, and any change in turbidity is typically monitored using a spectrophotometer, like I said. For the turbidimetric test, if your sample is already turbid, that could interfere with this method. The third method is the chromogenic test. It's quantitative rather than qualitative, and it's similar to the turbidimetric test. However, the LAL is chemically altered for this test so that rather than turning turbid, there is a color change to yellow. It is a highly sensitive assay. It can detect as low as 0.001 EUs per mil. And to give you an idea of how sensitive that is, it's equivalent to detecting a grain of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. However, with this method, of course, if you have a deeply coloured sample, that may be an issue. Of course, the GMP endotoxin test has a limit of the amount of endotoxin that you can have in your sample before it can cause a problem, and that is determined taking into account the maximum dosage given to the patient over an hour and the weight of the patient. Now, These tests are all rapid methods. They only take an hour or two. So why are they outdated? This is because of where LEL comes from. LEL is actually derived from horseshoe crab blood. LEL comes from the animal's blood cells, the amoebocytes, and it was discovered around 50 years ago, and it is still the most sensitive indicator of endotoxin contamination. It's actually now one of the most valuable liquids on Earth, and if you have a look at this bottle on the bottom right here, a full bottle that size would be worth 10 to 20,000 pounds. And this is becoming very detrimental to horseshoe crab populations. Despite having been around since before the dinosaurs and surviving 4 mass extinctions, these animals are often called living fossils. Their populations have plummeted in the past 50 years. It's not just due to biomedical research, I have to emphasize. They're also harvested for bait, they're being killed due to fertilizer runoff, climate change, and also habitat destruction. But a combination of these issues is really becoming a problem for biomedical research and something we have to look closer at. Currently, 500,000 crabs need harvested annually for LEL. And in March 2019, the Chinese horseshoe crab was listed as endangered. Similarly, in 2016, the American horseshoe crab was classified as vulnerable. So clearly, this is becoming a major problem. I found a really good paper which reviews this issue and mentions finding a synthetic alternative to LEL, so do read this if you have time. So, what are the new developments? How are we overcoming this issue with horseshoe crabs? Well, the alternative is to use recombinant factor C instead of LEL. And this is not only superior in terms of avoiding the use of animals, but it is much more suitable and efficient. This is because LEL pathway is very long and it can produce false positives. If you look at the pathway here, it started by factor C. If factor C and endotoxin come into contact, it causes this cascade of events. And this results in either the turbidity or the yellow color that I was talking about in the previous presentation. Unfortunately, though, false positives can result from the glucan pathway. Beta-glucan-like molecules can interact with factor G, as you can see in this diagram, and for this reason the LEL assay is actually deemed unsuitable for some test articles. They would have to be tested by the rabbit Pyrogen test, a much older test, or the more recent monocyte activation test. But this is a newer development. LEL was used for a decade before the factor G pathway was even discovered, and the lack of characterization of LEL is actually described as a problem that has never really been acknowledged. But now we have a solution. Recombinant factor C utilizes the same initial factor C activation step, but it doesn't involve factor G. In fact, it results in a much shorter pathway producing fluorescence upon contact with endotoxin, which can then be measured. It's the ideal replacement for LEL. So what is the status of LEL and recombinant factor C in the GMP industry? Well, since 2016, the European Pharmacopoeia has mentioned the use of alternative reagents in 5.1.10. And 5 months ago, the 165th EP Commission announced that it expects to include Chapter 2.6.32, Test for Bacterial Endotoxins Using Recombinant Factor C, as one of the 4 general chapters to be adopted in its next version, and that will be effective as of January 1st next year. In the US, in 2018, the first drug was released using recombinant factor C assay for endotoxin testing, and the USP is now developing a standalone chapter similar to the EP for recombinant methods, proposed to be published in January to February next year also. So I decided to have a look at a few companies and see what they offer, see if they're going down the recombinant factor C route or if they're still using LEL. And Merck and Charles River seem to still be using LEL as the go-to method. Although, of course, for many companies this may change in January when these new chapters highlight the use of recombinant factor C, and it may be perhaps easier to validate this method. Surprisingly, Lonza still had quite a significant portion of their website which was focused on the rabbit pyrogen test. In my mind, I had thought that this was really superseded by the endotoxin test, or for samples that really needed tested for other pyrogens, or if they interfered with the factor G pathway, then they could be tested by the monocyte activation test, but they are still offering the rabbit test as standard. However, they do also offer the Pyrogen RFC assay, which is very exciting. It is their own endotoxin test using recombinant factor C, and they also include a validation protocol in their website. So, Cleanroom Technology, I really like this website. It's a bit of a hit or miss with some articles, but there's some really good information on the website about current technology and new developments. So, if you don't want to have a look at the Cleanroom Technology website, I would recommend it if you don't already. And there was a great article on it about recombinant factor C in the GMP industry and its role in aiding the demand for LEL endotoxin testing. The last thing that I wanted to look at were two kits that I thought are going to be really involved in the future of GMP endotoxin testing. And the first is EndoNext. This is another kit by BioMaru that's based on recombinant factor C. And they've stated on their website that they think that 6,000 horseshoe crabs don't need to be bled with a single 30-litre production run of animal-free recombinant factor C. This kit offers 100% endotoxin specificity, no false positives from factor G or interference due to coloured or turbid samples. It's approved for use and validated in the same way as LEL, following Pharmacopoeia BET chapters. And one thing I found really neat about this kit is that you don't have to prep the standard yourself. It comes with a plate which is preloaded robotically with a standard curve, which obviously can take away any operator variation or operator error. The last kit I wanted to look at was the Charles River EndoSafe LEL cartridges. I know what you may be thinking, that this kit still uses LEL, so why did I find it so advanced or so interesting? And the reason is that this little chip here uses only 5% of the LEL that standard endotoxin tests use. It's cheaper than other methods and, much simpler. You get results in 15 minutes and spikes and positive controls are preloaded into this cartridge. So all you have to do is add your sample, and I thought that was really neat. There's a portable reader, and again, it's a very simple reader. Once you inserted your sample, the reader reads your sample in 15 minutes. So in conclusion, there are many more alternative products around. It's not just these two that I mentioned. There's a lot of great products out there that are alternatives to the traditional LEL test for detecting endotoxins. Pyrosmart and Pyrogen also look particularly promising for GMP endotoxin testing. And in future, it looks like we're moving away from horseshoe crab LEL and towards recombinant factor C endotoxin methods, or at least adapted methods using reduced LEL. And I just wanted to add this slide because I got asked why I didn't mention the monocyte activation test. And honestly, I wasn't very aware of the monocyte activation test. So just to put it in context of the rabbit and endotoxin test, the rabbit pyrogen test actually came first. And it is a method, it's quite rapid. You can get results in only 3 hours. But currently, because of the heavy animal use, most products that can be tested by the endotoxin test for GMP batch release are now using the endotoxin test. However, other products that maybe contain reagents that aren't suitable for the endotoxin test are now being tested by the monocyte activation test, which is a newer test, and in some ways it is described as superseding the rabbit pyrogen test. In fact, in the Pharmacopoeia, it recommends using the monocyte activation test, but all three tests are still available. So the rabbit pyrogen test and the monocyte activation test detect all pyrogens, whereas the endotoxin test just detects the significant pyrogen endotoxin, LPS.